Okay, just a quick for those of you all not familiar with my work. My work is largely to do with photographing Bombay city. This is what I've been doing for about the last 25 years. Now, one of the problems that come with an exercise like this, and I've grown up in this city, is that there are large parts of experiences of living in the city which kind of become blind spots for you, right? At the same time, this is also the sort of experience that kind of creates nuance in your work. And I think that is what is the critical aspect. Now, that nuance is not a very easily gained sort of thing. I grew up in Bombay and I didn't look at the city with any sense of wonder in those years. I mean, but that's probably because, I was busy growing up in the city, doing my college, passing my exams and doing all of that. And then this very interesting thing happened, quite by chance. Let me take you quickly back to about 1990. Some of you might remember the 1990s. In Bombay at that time, you had pavement booksellers at Flora Fountain. You don't see them anymore, And I believe if those guys weren't there, I probably wouldn't have become a photographer. I want you can see this. I hope you can see this. One of those days, I happened to be walking around Flora Fountain and I chanced upon a magazine. A magazine that I had never heard of, I had never seen before. It was a magazine called Life. It was the world's most famous picture magazine ever. Okay, the issue that I picked up had stories on the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which had happened just a couple of months ago. Nicolae Ceausescu's palace up in flames in Romania, civil war on the streets of Romania and stuff like that. I had no idea stuff like what was happening in the world. Suddenly this one magazine opened up things for me, okay? Over the course of perhaps the next 1 year or so, I kept finding a lot of other issues of Life magazine. One of them it was a special issue and it carried this particular text. This is actually very, very inspiring. I mean, I carry this in my wallet at all times. It's there even now. It's actually the Manifesto of Life magazine as it was envisioned by Henry Luce way back when the magazine was set up. And it's just fabulous. What it tells you is really, if you read it, is look at the world with wonder. That's what the photographers at Life, the most celebrated names in photography, did for all those years, okay? I think what it did for me was, for the first time, it made me look at my city, okay? I was obviously dreaming of a career as a photographer, doing the kind of things that those photographers were doing, going to wars, photographing Hollywood film stars and all of that. Obviously, I wasn't going to be doing that. But, I mean, what's the harm in dreaming, right? So I was. But I think coinciding with that period is when I started taking baby steps in photography. I'll cut to the chase. I begin my career in photography after a couple of years in advertising. I find myself in Calcutta on an assignment, and I'm trying to photograph the Esplanade area, if you're familiar with Calcutta, trying to photograph a cityscape which was needed for that story. And with my limited equipment, I was having trouble photographing a particular building that is a bit of a landmark in that area. There's an insurance company building which is crowned with a clock, okay? My belief is that it gave me so much of trouble trying to get that clock included in the picture that the idea of buildings with clocks got stuck in my head. And I was back in Bombay some weeks later, and in a moment of boredom, I started noticing buildings with clocks in Bombay. And I think it was the beginning of a sort of 22-year-long obsession with trying to find Bombay's public clocks, okay? This project, I mean, I've been doing a lot of projects parallelly, but this is probably the longest running work that I've done. It continues even now. It's not over. There's still one building left, actually 2 buildings left to be photographed. But this is the problem with trying to do a long project, which is, say I bump into one of y'all today here, I mean, getting introduced to you after you see this work, and you tell me, oh, but there's a clock on the street where I stay, and I realized that I didn't know about it. It's quite a chance encounter and something like that. And so the project is still not over. Okay? So you continue to kind of experience your city. This project kind of took me around to parts of the city that earlier I would never have thought of going. Right? I mean, so let me start quickly by showing you. I'm not going to show you all the entire work because of a time constraint. So I found a total of 80 buildings with clocks in Bombay. Okay, let me give you a sort of a background information that kind of popped up in the course of these 22 years while we were researching. We all kind of follow a certain time, which is what we call as Indian Standard Time. If you realize that before 1905, in India, there was no standard time. So the time followed in Calcutta, the time followed in Bombay, the time followed in Karachi and in Dhaka were all different as per the location of the sun, right? And I'm talking undivided India here. So time got standardized in India in about 1905. Around before this, okay, at the turn of the century, Bombay had a bit of a curious situation that it found itself in. There were 3 different kinds of time that were followed simultaneously in the city. So you can imagine the chaos that must have prevailed. So around the 1870s, there was something that came about, what is called the Indian Mean Time, and this also Madras time. This was based on the position of the sun in Madras, because in undivided India, if you can picture it in your head, Chennai would have been somewhere roundabout in the middle, okay, between Karachi and Dhaka, that sort of thing, between Pakistan and Bangladesh. It was also the reason why this time was followed was because Chennai had the only observatory at the time which could, in real time, transmit time electrically all over the country. Okay, this was something that was followed by the British government offices and the Post and Telegraph at that time. Some years later, there was something that got introduced called as port signal time. Bombay was a port city, and port cities at that time were very important locations because most trade was happening through shipping channels and stuff like that. This was synchronized to GMT and followed largely by the maritime trade. Okay. Some of you might have noticed a clock tower when you go down PD Mello Road, okay, either on the left or the right, depending on the route you're taking, what is called as Ghadial Godi, okay, or Prince's Dock. That clock was one of the most important clocks at a particular time, and which is how the port signal time used to be read. So all the ships that used to be docked on the eastern side would be following that clock. So they would be at about 1:10 each day, they would be waiting for a ball drop to happen, and all the ships would be looking out and setting their time. It's a bit like when we were growing up, the 9 o'clock alarm, the siren that used to go up. It's a bit like that, but this used to be done visually. Okay? Now, connected to this particular clock tower used to be a cannon which would fire, and the rest of the city, through sound, would set time. So you can imagine how quiet the city must have been at a certain point of time. And then there was obviously Bombay time, or what was also called Kolaba time, which is what was done according to the position of the sun in Bombay. Okay? And these were followed by, local shops and establishments, the local offices and things like that. So you can imagine the chaos that existed. Now, so in 1905, when people were talking about wanting to standardize time, in Bombay, there was a lot of resistance to it. Okay, in Bombay specifically, there was a lot of resistance. And this is a letter that was that goes back to 1906, a letter to the chief secretary, which basically talks about, this being India, there's always a religious angle to everything, right? I mean, so this is somebody kind of writing this letter and saying how different communities looked at time, okay? So it says the adoption of standard time in Bombay is highly prejudicial to the interests of religious communities. They offer prayers. The azan of the second prayer of the Mohammedans, which is local time to be standardized, would be 11:51 when the sun would not be overhead. So all these kind of little nuances that were suddenly coming into play, and people were resisting this move to standardize time across the country. There was obviously also a scientific kind of reasons to kind of oppose the move. I'm showing you these just so you know that what is the background to the project. I mean, at a time when all these buildings came up, which I photographed, the oldest building goes back to one of the earliest buildings in Bombay, which is the St. Thomas Cathedral, which is 1718, okay? The clock came up a little later. So if some of you all are familiar with looking at old images of Bombay, largely etchings and stuff like that, you will see pretty much a barren landscape and a cathedral there, and that's the St. Thomas Cathedral. It's the cathedral which also marked point 0 for all the remaining milestones in the city, okay? So I'll move to the photographs. Now, one of the things some of you may have noticed, now that I'm talking about public clocks, some of you may have noticed clocks while you move around, okay? And you may have also noticed that most of these don't work. So there are very few guys in the city who actually maintain these clocks. This is one of those guys. His name is Mohammad Bhai Damani. He's of Ethiopian descent. This is the guy who set in order the Synagogue clock tower. Okay, that's the Synagogue clock tower. The Synagogue clock tower the clock was kind of sitting defunct for a few decades actually, when the BPT decided that okay, let's do something, let's get this back working, which is when they got hold of Damani, who has a bit of expertise in kind of repairing clocks and stuff. It's a lovely story. So Damani goes up and he discovers that the machinery, or whatever is remaining of the machinery of the clocks, is encased in about, this is what he told me, in about 2 or 3 inches of pigeon poop. Okay? So this guy sits very meticulously scraping, the poop off, and then he kind of sees metal, shiny metal. But the point also is you have to realize how tiny that clock room was. I mean, it would probably be about the size of that loo there. Okay? This guy sits there for a few months with little pieces of thin ply, and which he's kind of cutting to kind of see. Suppose he's making a gear, he's kind of sawing it and then fitting it to see are they fitting. And that's how those 71 missing parts, which he kind of thought weren't there, were kind of fashioned, and then they were recast and the clock was set back. So right now, the arrangement of these photographs is in a more linear way, which is more south to north that I've done for this presentation. That's the clock of the Navy, the Lions Gate. See, some of these, which are more managed by institutions, those are kind of still better maintained. There are people to take care of them. There's an infrastructure, like for instance, VT station, the railways takes care of it and all that. This sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It's a library. Who cares about libraries? So they don't have money to take care of their books. What are they going to take care of their clocks? So it worked, and then it right now doesn't work again. Okay, that's the David Sassoon Library. That's the Industrial Assurance Building at Churchgate. Some of you may have noticed it. For many years, the hands were missing, like with a lot of the Art Deco clocks in Bombay. Okay, sorry. Now, one of the things that you will realize, perhaps, is when you look at these pictures, or now that it's been brought to your attention when you start moving around the city, you might start wondering why did so many clocks come up? Okay, One of the reasons perhaps is that architecture served an additional social responsibility at a time when people didn't have wristwatches, or people having your personal clock, a personal watch wasn't very common, right? So how would you go by your day? So if you look at a lot of these buildings, what you will realize is the kind of location of the buildings, the kind of orientation of the building, the elevations. Like for instance, this building, if you can picture this building in your head, if you have seen it, you will realize if you're walking down from Flora Fountain, if you're coming from Marine Lines, if you're coming along the Oval, this is a building that you will be able to see from a distance. Okay, if you are at Cross Maidan, you will be able to see it from a distance. You know, you come out of the university gates across the Oval, you will be able to see the building. So how you saw these buildings became very important in the way that these buildings were located and how architects perhaps imagined the city and the buildings that they were doing. That's good old Rajabai Tower. You know, those are pictures. I wish you could see them a little clearly. These are pictures of the inside of the clock tower. It took many, many years to finally get permission to kind of be able to go up to see those machines. Again, I mean, you know, you kind of are going up through this really narrow stairwell, I mean, which is almost claustrophobic. But there is the second guy who kind of maintains Bombay's clocks is this guy called Mr. Rao. He kind of climbs up those many, it's some 200 odd steps, I think we counted when we were going up. This guy climbs up every 36 hours, meaning every alternate day he has to climb up, wind the clock, you know, and then he comes down. But the thing is, because the winding stays for about 36 hours, things like that. So this, again, I mean, took a bit of work to kind of keep this clock in working condition and things like that, but the university seems to be interested in doing a good job. There is no clock here in this picture. That blank spot that you see is a little note to myself about not being lazy and kind of moving the moment you spot something. There used to be a clock there. This is on the Brabant Stadium. Somewhere around, you know, where the K. Rustam's shop is, somewhere over there. It's a clock which is probably one of the most difficult ones to spot because usually a tree covered it. And I kind of would see it occasionally, you know, if I'm passing and there's a kind of a breeze and, you know, suddenly you get to see it. I saw it literally quite by chance like that. And I kept telling myself, I'm going to go back and shoot it. I'm going to go back and shoot it. And a few years went by. And suddenly one day the clock was gone. Okay? In a similar way, a lot of clocks have disappeared. Some that I've already documented, some that I missed. But this is one of them. And the weird part is that nobody that I've spoken to kind of remembers this clock at all. Okay? No one in that building, people who have shops there, nobody remembers this clock. I haven't found archival or vintage photographs of it either. Okay, that's the St. Thomas Cathedral, which I was saying is the oldest building in Bombay. That's a drinking water fountain. Now, one of the things that you will notice also is the range of utilities that each of these structures kind of serve. That's a drinking water fountain, or what is in Bombay called as a pyao, constructed through public subscription. Okay. And so you saw libraries, you saw office buildings, you saw, you know, clock towers and docks, so all kinds of things. I mean, you'll also see colleges and stuff. Now, these are like curious ones. I mean, these are actually two clocks which were there not on the outside of buildings, but just above the elevator in the foyer of two buildings on Firod Shah Mehta Road. Okay. And this kind of set me thinking for a while as to, because they were like wildly fascinating, you know, in the way that they were located. So I didn't want to give up on them, but I had to kind of justify why they were part of a body of work on public clocks. Were they public in that sense? And then the questions came up, okay, but they are in the foyer of the building where people are waiting, for the elevator. So in a way, there is public engagement, So these two were kind of included. These are again Art Deco clocks. I mean, so you will see clocks which are in, on Art Deco buildings, in the British built buildings, also in a lot of the vernacular architecture that you see. Now, this is an interesting photograph simply from the point of view of trying to explain how one navigated. If you walk around Fort, where you actually see a cluster of them, Fort was obviously what was the business district, right? So it was important for people to know the time to be able to keep appointments, right? So if you see in this picture, you're actually seeing two clocks. This clock, by the way, has now disappeared. That's the Citibank building on DN Road. That has a clock there, and you walk down that road, which is Firoz Shah Mehta Road. Few buildings after that, you'll have Lakshmi building. And that's another Art Deco building with a Lakshmi statue on the top. A little bit of a curious thing happened. Some years back, I was supposed to go to Karachi on one of those, those artist exchange programs, and I started thinking, so what would I do in Karachi? And one of the things that I thought of was, can one replicate photographing Bombay's public clocks in Karachi? As in, could one photograph public clocks in Karachi? Now, thanks to the internet, it's possible to sit in Bombay and do a bit of research. So I started doing research. I came in contact with a whole variety of people, locals in Karachi, photographers, journalists, all kinds of people, and who got excited and who then started looking for clocks. I mean, obviously what popped up in the beginning was the usual suspects, which everybody in Karachi would know about. One of the buildings that popped up was a building that looked really, really similar, okay? And later, over the months, we figured that the architects of the two buildings, the one in Bombay and the one in Karachi, were the same people. So the two buildings are reasonably identical, except that one didn't have the Lakshmi statue on top, okay? That's St. Xavier's College. It's also got the tiniest and the flimsiest clock in the city, perhaps, okay? So, one of the things we started doing in the last about two years, some of my students were working with me on the project during that period, and they were helping me with a bit of research. One of the things we thought we'll do is go out and do a lot of interviews with ordinary people who in some way might be connected with the clocks. So at the end of the day, this is a technology story, right? I mean, it's a story about the city, it's a story about technology, about the redundancy of technology. The reason we are probably not caring about these clocks is because if you need to know the time, you will pull out your mobile. You're not going to be looking up, right? So I was curious about how much did people care about these clocks? Did they at all matter to people? And I wanted real voices. So we started doing a lot of interviews with people in various neighborhoods, people whose houses might just be overlooking a now defunct but once working clock, or the vada pav guy outside VT station who throughout the day is looking at VT, things like that, a cabbie who's probably crisscrossing the city and things like that. Fascinating bits of thing came out. St. Xavier's College was interesting. So some of the students, 19, 20-year-olds who had no clue that what we were talking about. So very often they said, "Clock, what clock are you talking about?" Okay. One of the peons in the building had a very funny story. He said, we believed for a long time that the clock used to work. So we said, "What do you mean?" He said, so supposedly the clock, the hands, at one point, the minute hand used to be at say the 15 point, okay? So sometimes when a pigeon would go and sit on it, the thing would go down, and so the joke in the college was, "Oh no, look, the clock is working," So we came up with lots of lovely anecdotal stuff of that kind. That's on Princess Street. It's a bit of a unusual building because the clock is at the rear of the building. Again, I was talking to you all about these interviews. We were talking with the head priest of this Atish Behram, and he suddenly told my student that, there are two grandfather clocks inside. I wish I could have shown them to you, but because this guy wouldn't be allowed to go inside the fire temple, and that's why he said that. He said, but if you, I'll tell you something curious about the grandfather clock. One of them is set to Bombay time, even now. Okay, so we were wondering why that is the case. So the thing is, for Parsis, the prayer time is set as per the position of the sun in the location where the fire temple is. So a fire temple in Calcutta would have a different prayer time from the fire temple in, say, Bombay. Okay, and then he went on to tell us that the fire temple at Udwada, which is the holiest place of worship for Parsis, that it seems is still set to Bombay time. And the reason for that is because that used to be part of the Bombay presidency, okay, before the segregation of states happened. Again, this is the building which many of you all may have seen. It's the one at the corner of Chowpatty, right above Cafe Ideal. One of the problems with most of these buildings, I mean, people very often kind of say, oh, but no one cares about heritage. No one's maintaining these. Can't we do something? The problem really in Bombay is what is known as the Rent Control Act, which is what has really screwed over a lot of landlords. Okay, so the Rent Control Act means that a guy here, in this humongous kind of flats, his wife actually kind of put it very poignantly. She said, she asked me, do you know how much rent we get from one of these flats? So I said, no idea. I mean, I kind of got a feeling that where she's coming from. She put it very beautifully. She said, a dish at, you go to Cream Center, a dish at Cream Center would be a little more expensive than what we get as rent. Okay, now given that, you realize how difficult it is to maintain some of these buildings. Okay, this is actually, this is actually the inside of the clock room. I'm showing you these because the inside of this particular building, it's a two-tier sort of thing. This is, the inside of the clock room would probably be as big as this place where you all are sitting. Okay, so you can imagine. Above it, there's a little staircase which takes you above to another tiny room, which had at one point the mechanism which powered a revolving neon sign on top of the building. This was India's first revolving neon sign. It was a Mercedes-Benz neon sign. Lots of people that we spoke to in the course of our interviews kind of remembered that neon sign. Okay. Later, it seems it became a thumbs-up neon sign and all, and then now there's something else. But these owners had a chance of being able to revive the clock because there was a chance that they would be able to collaborate with people like Victorinox and all of that. But none of it came through, so the clock languishes. And it went from being an electrical clock to a battery-powered clock, and the battery, they figured, is not powerful enough to kind of move those big hands, so it just languishes now. Okay, this is a building. If you can see, this is short with a gap of a couple of years. So you have the clock, and then you see how it's kind of got damaged now with all these mobile phone towers which are sticking out from the terraces of buildings. These clocks are get either covered or they've kind of just fallen in and things like that. This is again, this is in Thakurdwar near the Harkishan Das Hospital. This is one of my favorites. It's also a very small clock. It's on the signboard of a cloth shop, or what used to be a cloth shop. It's now closed down. And the dial of the clock doesn't have numbers, but it has the alphabets, which is Sridhar, Bhalchandra, Ani Sons. Okay, so those alphabets is what make up the individual. They kind of are in place of the numbers. So this shop has subsequently closed down because the owner told me who comes to buy the traditional Maharashtrian 9-yard saris. I mean, so he's gone defunct, but thankfully the space survives. His nephew, who's a chartered accountant, kind of occupies the space now, and the clock, they hope to repair it. This is, a building which is on the main Thakurdwar road. I'm showing you this for just this anecdotal thing. People have often asked me, so how did you find these buildings? And so I was again on another day with a different student of mine. We got off a taxi to go somewhere to photograph something, and which is when she asked me, and I kind of said, it could just be that we are walking down the street and I look up and there's a clock. And the moment I did that, there was this clock. So literally I found buildings in completely coincidental ways like that. I mean, so I remember going through my friend Kaivan Mehta's book on Kalba Devi and flipping through it and suddenly seeing a photograph of a drinking water fountain that had a clock. So it's all that. So my mother spotted one, by the way. I mean, she's never looked around carefully at the city. But I think she got taken up by my obsession for so long that one day she spotted a clock, So that's the Bhuleshwar Ram Mandir. This is a fairly recent photograph. The earlier photographs, you never saw the high-rise coming up. So this particular temple kind of loomed in that junction. But now it's kind of dwarfed by the buildings coming up around. There are also like odd buildings of this kind. This is on PD Mello Road at Karnak Bandar. Just when you hit PD Mello Road, it will be on the left. These aren't grand buildings or anything. It's a 2-story building with a little humble clock. Again, not working. So I mean, this is the sort of building which makes you wonder, why did the architect put up a clock here? Because it's the sort of building which is not on a busy road. So is it only for a decorative purpose? Is it only an embellishment? I have found it hard to agree with the logic of it being just an embellishment, because I think for the building owners and stuff, I mean, it becomes an added level of complication the moment you have something like a clock. But it's been hard to find answers to things like that. That's the Ghadiyal Godi that I was telling you all about. A lot of you all might recognize it. Again, you see the location, how these buildings are located. You can see the Ghadiyal Godi in the corner there, and that's the Indian Sailors' Home. Again, an important building in Bombay. Not too many people know that there's a memorial inside, which is actually the memorial for a lot of Indian sailors who lost their life during the World War. It sits at Masjid Bandar, a place where not too many people amongst us seem to go. Okay, and across from where I'm standing, behind me is the railway track, and across the tracks is this particular tower, which is the Khojas have a Jamaat Khana, which is at this area called Bhat Bazar. That's the tower of the Jamaat Khana. Again, I remember going up to do this photograph. Earlier, the photograph that I had shot, and this again is an advantage of doing a long project, right? You can keep revisiting. And I remember going up to one of these houses, which in the beginning I had apprehensions or whatever. And these people, very lovely. They were telling me, look around you. You can see 3 wall clocks in a house, but who looks at them? Because we have the clock right in front. This clock works. What's also interesting is, if you see the earlier photographs of this particular building, it's hard to imagine how dwarfed this clock tower is now. Because 20 years back, when the first photograph of this was done, there were no high-rises in this area. Mohammad Ali Road, that whole area, Dongri, Masjid, had 3 or 4-story houses, So the clock tower loomed over that landscape in the way that clock towers are meant to. Now, the clock tower is kind of dwarfed and it kind of merges with all these high rises which crop up in the background. That's a drinking water pyao again. So there's been a project to revive a lot of the drinking water pyaos in Bombay, but this one was also revived, but the clock wasn't. So there's a plastic Ajanta clock which has been kind of stuck into that cavity there. The guy who sits underneath dispensing water, he kind of told us that gradually the parts were kind of pilfered away by people who wanted to sell it off as scrap. Because it was nice, good brass and steel, I guess. That's the railway station, Ray Road. Again, you can see the variety of uses, the variety of applications, kind of buildings that you're seeing these clocks in. Okay. Synagogue, places of worship. You saw temples, you saw mosques. That's a synagogue. That's the one in Baikala, Magan David. That's the Sassoon Clock Tower. So there are a few of these freestanding clocks in clock towers in the city. This is one of them. Rajabai Tower obviously is another. This is the one my mother spotted. Hats off to her. It's a real tough one to spot. This is at Mahalakshmi, to go to Mahalakshmi temple from across Cadbury House. It's again a gate like the Sassoon Dock gate. That's the Podar Hospital. Again, to get a sense of the different kinds of utilities, the different kinds of buildings that you're seeing. I remember we went to meet the, the dean of the building, and he was really embarrassed when we asked him about the clock because he didn't know about it. And then he kind of really tried to quickly cover up by saying, but we get here on transfer. So I've just arrived, so I don't know about that. It had a clock. This is a mosque. You can probably see it now if you take the monorail, not too far from here. Obviously, the clock doesn't work, and the clock tower inside of the minaret is used as a dumping space for tube lights and plastic and tin cans and things like that. That's the Tejukaya Park. Again, this is at Matunga on King Circle. There are a couple of clock towers of this kind which are in the middle of gates of housing colonies. This is one of them. This is very well maintained by the residents of Tejukaya Park who talk to us. Really, really proud that they have a clock tower. Okay. That's Aurora Cinema, the other clock that I missed photographing out of sheer laziness. I grew up in Chembur. Going into town, I would see the clock often. It never worked, but I saw the clock. It had the little markings, it had the hands. By the time I got my act together and I said, okay, I need to go to Matunga and shoot, the clock was gone. So it's also, the way the clock disappeared, we found later, is also one of those very typical Bombay stories. The monsoons ate it up. So seepage during monsoon corroded all the parts inside, and the clock started working. And funnily enough, one fine day, without the owner knowing, the guys kind of just sold the pieces of metal as scrap. This is a really weird one. So I was talking with a friend of mine, telling her about this project that I'm doing. And she said, have you been to, there's one at near Science Station, and it's called the Ghadiwala building. So I said, is that the name, or meaning the Ghadiwala building, is that the actual name of the building, or do you call it locally as the Ghadiwala building? She said, I'm not very sure, but I can find out for you because a friend of mine stays there. And then she kind of joked and said how there were two guys in a class, both, let's assume their name was Sunil. So one of them who stayed in the building was often called as Sunil Ghadiwala. Okay, then eventually she kind of traced that guy. I land up there, that's his house. There is no clock. It's just a cavity over there. That's where the clock used to be. Some of these pictures, I'm sorry, you can see them on my website. You'll probably see them a little better. So that cavity there, the young, so his nephew's wife kind of was telling me, when I came into the family, got married and came in, we often wondered, what is that cavity? And then I was told there was a clock. And I'm like, who has a clock in the house like that? but she's never seen the clock. She kind of wishes there was a clock. But now she kind of uses that place to put out a bowl of water for the birds. Okay? Where is it gone? There is the, what's it called? The Swadeshi mill at Kurla. I'm assuming some other mills in Bombay may have had clocks. Okay? Because it's the sort of place where time would be necessary to mark, right? I mean, shifts changing and things like that. But I mean, where are the mills? So we don't know if any of them had clocks. This one, I remember seeing the clock for a long time while passing through Kurla station. But then a fire happened, like it happens with a lot of buildings in Bombay, dubious fires, and the clock disappeared. This is under litigation, so one can't go in and see. This is the last picture I'm showing you. In the geographical spread that I'm looking at, on the western side of Bombay, this is also the last one. This is at Vilepale, right opposite the Pavan Hans airport. That's a private residence of the Bhagat family, and which has a clock. The picture that there's a small request that I put out whenever couple of times that I've done a talk, and this is largely to tell people like you all that in case you spot any, to get in touch with me. Okay, because this is in a way a sort of crowd-funded project. So some people have pointed out things that I didn't know of, so you can. I think I'm going to end here. The rest we can tackle during Q&A, right? Yeah.